podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm Helen O'Grady, a Master Executive Coach and Coach Supervisor, and your host for this in-depth series on coaching supervision. Each episode delves into a distinctive aspect of supervision with leading practitioners and thought leaders in the field, uncovering the nuanced ways supervision enhances coaching practice, supports well-being and drives professional growth. Whether you're a seasoned supervisor, a coach curious about supervision, or simply interested in the dynamics of reflective practice, this series offers illuminating conversations that will transform how you think about coaching excellence. So I'm so honoured to welcome Michelle Lucas to the Association for Coaching Supervision podcast. Many of you experienced listeners will know Michelle. She's been a very long-standing member of the Association for Coaching and has volunteered for them. And she's also obviously an accredited master executive coach as well as an accredited master supervisor, having trained dually. I know, it's so exciting. At Oxford Brookes, both in coaching and coach supervision, and she teaches both of those as well through her organisation, and has co-authored lots of books, but in particular the most recent one, Creating the Reflective Habit.
That's right.
We're going to kind of dig in a little bit more around that in relation to coach supervision. So welcome, Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So nice to be here with you. So thanks so much. And I wonder whether we kick off by exploring what reflective practice means in terms of coaching supervision and your perception of how fundamental it is.
So I think it's really interesting how we can use language and we think we understand what we mean, but we might be talking at cross purposes. And I think reflective practice is one of those terms. Reflection is one of those terms. Reflexivity is another. And if I think about what reflective practice is, I see that as like an umbrella term. And so within that, I think there are three types of activities. The first is kind of self-supervision or independent reflection. So that would be supervision that you do for yourself, maybe journaling or maybe rewinding over a session. Then there's the reflective practice that we do alongside others that are colleagues, and maybe they're informal conversations and comparing notes, or maybe it's a bit more structured and it's peer supervision. And then there's the kind of third pillar, which is professional supervision, where we are quite deliberately paying somebody to support us to take what we have already done by ourselves and peers to the next level, if you like. A depth, perhaps, would be a better thing. When I wrote the book, the second chapter is a theory chapter, and we try to give a definition of what reflective practice is, or the reflective habit is. And one of the things that's key to that is its iterative nature. So what I think is really unhelpful is reflection sounds singular, doesn't it?
Yes.
You know, like, I've reflected on that, tick. No, for me, it's a really iterative process. So with those three pillars of reflective practice, we'll dance between them all. Just because we've taken it to professional supervision doesn't mean it's done and dusted. It would be really helpful to do some independent reflection about that or chat it through with some peers. It doesn't stop. It just evolves and morphs and often comes back several times before we have a sense of resolution. I hasten not to use the word solution. I don't really like that in the context of reflective practice. But I think we know when we kind of go, that's what it was about. And then we feel more resolved about it. Then there is a sense of completion. But generally speaking, we go round and round and twist and twirl before we have a sense of understanding what was going on.
And even with the resolution, my feeling is that just adds in new thinking and new learning that then goes in another side of iterative thinking.
Totally, yeah.
And you defined two of those terms, but not the third in terms of reflexivity. And I guess my brain goes, reflexivity, is that the iterative process, or is reflexivity something else?
I think there's a theoretical definition, which is kind of thinking about your thinking. But if I were defining it, when we work with clients, we sometimes talk about dancing in the moment with the client when we're kind of in flow and we're responding to the, in that moment, adaptation of what we choose to do next. And so for me, reflexivity is when we're dancing in the moment with ourselves because we're noticing something arising and we're interpreting it and adjusting it in terms of what we do next. So it's that kind of reflexivity, is that ability to have two levels of attention, one for what's happening and one for what might need to happen next. So that kind of dancing in the moment with ourselves is my best explanation of it. And it's in many ways imperceptible to the client, perhaps, but you're doing it. It's what helps us become more skillful and develop more of a craft than just seeing coaching as a to-do or a task. That's how I see it. I'm not sure that's what the theorists technically see it as, but that's how I see it.
That really resonates. And you've also pulled to how that changes as coaches become more experienced.
Yeah.
And that relates to something I've been talking around with a few people in supervision recently, around the discipline it takes to actually have that reflexivity in the moment, to notice, not do anything with it, park it, make decisions about what to do next. And that's very hard. As you say, it's imperceptible on the outside, so people look like they're not doing much, but actually we're working very hard when we're actively using reflexivity in the moment.
And I think part of the maturity journey is that it might not even be possible to do that when we're earlier in our craft. And that's why we need reflection and supervision, because maybe it's not helpful to work with that in the moment because it would be too clunky or maybe not even accessible. But absolutely, it's important. So where do we take it to work with it so that we can bring it back in? So that's iteration on another level. That's what I love about coaching. Generally speaking, you've got an ongoing relationship, so it's never too late, right? You can go, after the event, I wish I coulda, woulda, shoulda. Well, you can.
Yeah.
Think about how you're going to bring it in.
That to me is like building the muscle, isn't it? That we
definitely
take it to the gym, and supervision is where we build those muscles in order, as you say, to take it back into the real world of coaching and that double loop, triple loop. So interesting. And for coaches who are trying to build that reflexivity, particularly around their own practice, what could they do as opposed to simply reviewing? And you kind of talked about that as one part of it, but you also described kind of going a bit deeper.
So I don't think there's a one size fits all.
Phew. I'm kind of relieved to hear that, Michelle.
So part of my answer is, well, that's the work, right?
Yeah.
You've got to work out how it works for you. And I think my biggest kind of regret, but also biggest criticism of coach training schools is that they either make the assumption that you know how to reflect, or the prevailing thought, and I think this comes from our helping practitioner cousins in clinicians, where they're very much into journaling and writing. And going off track a bit, but the whole reason I wrote the book is because, ironically, even though I can write as an author, writing doesn't help me as a reflector. And it took me a long time to recognise that I wasn't a bad reflector, I was just a bad journaler. But I thought the two things were synonymous, right? And so my advice and my support to my own supervisees is, let's not forget, we've got 5 different processing styles, minimum. So there's cognitive, which is the writing, but I'm very visual and I'm also quite kinesthetic. Some people are auditory and some people like metaphors. And so knowing what works for you is important, because if I stare at a blank page trying to reflect on a client, that page stays blank for quite some time. And then I get frustrated, and then the ironing needs doing, because pretty much anything would be more exciting than writing that reflection. If, on the other hand, I've got some picture cards that I use for my work, and if I'm feeling like I want to understand more of what happened with the client, I might just look through the picture cards, see which one resonates for me, and that will be my springboard for wherever I go next. But it's enjoyable. It's fun looking at pictures, right? It isn't fun staring at a blank page. And again, kinesthetic, I'm a dog owner and I naturally do a walk first thing in the morning and last thing at night. Those are great opportunities for me to walk into the day to prepare or to digest from the day. And that means I've had to break the rule of reflecting directly after a client session, because that's what I was taught. I'm questioning that. Was I taught that? I don't know where the assumption came, whether or not that was the training school or me, but it took me a while to realise that actually maybe immediately after isn't the right time. Not for me. There'll be many people where it is. And this is why it's quite hard to advise people, because You've just got to give it a go and see what seems to work for you. And don't blame the method. Think about your broadest kind of preferences. And things like, you really come to need to know yourself as a reflective practitioner, not just as a person. So generally speaking, I'm an introverted thinker. But actually what I notice in my own preparations or digestions of supervision is that I'm an extroverted thinker. And that's not how I am generally, but it is how I am in my reflection. So give me a peer to choose something over with, and their responses help me deepen my thoughts to a place where it's not that I can't go with journaling, it's much more effort. So you have to come to re-know yourself, because things that are true for your wider life might not be true for your reflective self.
Also, I can see two dimensions here, well, more than two, but one around, again, how that might change over the course of a career and our experience, but also how that might change with the different clients that we're working with. So some reflection, I might be very visual, and some I'm like, I really need to talk about this, or I need to move.
Absolutely. There might be something that's borrowed from, we think about parallel process. If you've got a very kinesthetic coaching client, well, maybe the reflection on them needs to be done kinesthetically, even though we might not be a kinesthetic reflector. It's a great catch. We've got to experiment and find out what will work.
And again, that notion of experimenting, as you say, knowing ourselves, but being careful about, I guess, not being habitual. And okay, either I journal or I do this or I do that. And actually, again, like we do with our coaching and our supervision, pushing ourselves to give something that maybe on the surface we might think might not work and sometimes surprise us.
No, I think it's important to keep fresh. And I also think when I do a monthly reflective practice call and I offer people 5 different prompts and I say, have a go with a couple of them, see what works. And what's interesting is if one doesn't work for you, you've got a choice. You can put it down and try something else, but sometimes leaning into that resistance is useful. So to work out of preference, especially if there's some resistance in the system, because in doing that, you begin to viscerally feel what that resistance is like. So it's good to keep things fresh. It's good to make choices around resistance. And I think it is good to be habitual in the sense that I hate the word discipline because it always makes me think, oh God,
I'm in trouble.
The rebel in me comes out. But I think that is the difference about reflective practice and simply musing. So with reflective practice, we are being quite deliberate in making it happen. And that's not to say it's Friday, it's 9 o'clock. Friday, it's 9 o'clock, so I must reflect. But we have a process or a rhythm, perhaps is a better way of explaining it, where we commit to doing that work. It's not okay to do it as and when we feel like it, because actually we might have stuff that's below the surface that's in service of our clients. And if we don't know we're going to attend to that, that just feels like something's a bit flaky.
And again, so there's something there around intention, but also that building the muscle that we don't know we need it until we actually take it to the gym, and then it's available to us. Or like, suddenly I've got to run for the bus. Sugar.
Yeah, sugar. No, I'm not ready. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think some of building that muscle is knowing what kinds of reflections will work for you under what kind of circumstances.
And that notion of resistance, I found that interesting because I could kind of hear the parallel process around how that might show up in our coaching spaces, and if we're using that in our reflective spaces, being more comfortable when we might be working with resistance with our clients as coaches. So that was making me think there around, I hadn't thought about that. Talking of resistance, what do you think the resistance is sort of coach supervisors or barriers, both for coach supervisors or coaches, to engage in reflective practice?
I think there's a number. I think one is that for those people, however you were taught to reflect, if that's not your natural way of reflecting, then there's the resistance right away, right? Because you don't enjoy it. It's hard work to get somewhere. You don't really want to do it. So there's something about the method can get in the way. And that's why I think it's important to know what kind of methods are likely to inspire you to do more. I think we're all time poor. So I think there is a danger that it just doesn't fit in. And I think the thing that is probably least palatable is that often there's no burning platform. People often come to supervision because there's something difficult that they want to unpick. And actually, the first thing that when I'm working with a new supervisee is to say, you're very welcome to bring back that. But what about bringing all the stuff that you're already good at? Because there's learning in there. And what about the stuff that's coming up? It doesn't have to have happened already in order to reflect. We might want to call it pre-flexion, but we can look ahead and prepare ourselves. So I think sometimes the thing that gets in the way is that people don't value what might already be there if it's not a problem. So if we've got a problem, it's clear that we need to reflect on. But actually, there's masses that we could reflect on, and doesn't have to be a problem, to generate learning. And so I think it's the fact that we can get away without doing it and nothing disastrous happens. But perhaps our learning could be accelerated if we did.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think when you put the time poor and there's no burning platform together, you can see why it gets to the bottom of the list. Oh, and by the way, I think as coaches, we're much better at looking after other people than we are about looking after ourselves. And I see reflective practice as a bit of self-care. And so often the coach or the supervisor puts themselves to the bottom of the list. But as we all know, you can't serve from an empty vessel. So that's an argument for putting ourselves a bit higher up on that list.
And I think there's an ethical element to that as well, isn't there? Around actually, we do need to look after ourselves. We need to role model. We expect a lot of our clients in terms of reflecting in coaching and doing the work. From my view, we have to be willing to do that for ourselves.
Absolutely. We talk about coaches or self as instrument. We need to make sure it's tuned then, don't we?
For sure.
And this is the work.
Yeah. You were saying earlier about the language being unhelpful, and reflection means different things as well. And you kind of alluded to in different disciplines that it means different things. What have you noticed? And is there a theme that in particular professions coming into coaching or coach supervisors that think of reflection or reflective practice in a different way? Or
Yeah, I think, and this might be a broad generalization, but, in the more clinical disciplines, there is a tendency to review cases. So that is a client piece of work. And of course, we do that in coaching supervision. My sense is that coaching supervision is much broader. So it may be a client case. It may be something that's about your coaching approach. Or dare I say, it might be about your coaching business, which is rarely something that you'd hear a clinical supervisor spend some time on. They might even say it's definitely out. That's not what we do. But I fundamentally think that how well our business is going will influence our confidence. And if our confidence is high or low, that makes a difference to how we show up with the next client. So I think it's all intertwined. I think coaching supervision is broader, might include those financial, more commercial elements from time to time. And I also think it's more regulated, isn't it, in the clinical professions? And therefore the supervisor has a duty almost to make sure that every client that's in their supervisee's portfolio has attention. Whereas as a coaching supervisor, I think it's quite useful to do a check. I try to do it about annually with my individual supervisees that, who's actually in your portfolio and who have we talked about? Who haven't we talked about and why might that be? So that's quite interesting. But I absolutely trust the supervisee to decide what it is they want to bring. I do have that kind of backstop, if you want to call it, but actually I'll go with their flow. I don't feel the responsibility to look at every single client that they're working with. And I think that's because it's a different client group. Generally speaking, we all have our vulnerabilities, but a clinical supervisor knows that some of the clients are going to be vulnerable people, or they're going to be struggling with their resourcefulness in some way. Whereas I don't feel that kind of pressure as a coaching supervisor. Generally speaking, people are resourceful. They might have lost sight of it for a while, and they might be vulnerable at a level, but then I don't feel as concerned to do a 100% check of a portfolio as I might if I was a clinical supervisor.
And I think it's about that responsibility, isn't it? That's the difference. We don't have that same degree of accountability. And what you're saying is actually we trust the coaches, the clients who come in terms of reflection, they get to pick. Whereas in a different population, it's like, no, we actually need to talk about this or that, or all of the clients. So it's a different emphasis, isn't it?
Yeah.
And we've talked about this, but I guess let's go down a level in terms of supervisors being reflective and having that intention and practice, as you were talking about. how can they then influence the coaches that they work with in terms of reflection?
I guess there's a number of layers to it. So at a really basic level, when I work with a group or with an individual supervisor, my promise is not to get them to a solution. My promise is to stir the pot. And therefore, there's an expectation that we will have moved something and shifted something, but we might not have got it across a finish line. So implicitly, they're going to have to do some more work in order to find that sense of resolution that I was talking about earlier. By the same token, I'm quite candid with them and say, look, prepare for supervision or talk to your peers about the stuff that is with you. Why are you paying me to help you with the low-hanging fruit,
Yeah.
Do the easy stuff yourself. Bring me the crunchy stuff that you can't quite get to, either yourself or with your peers. That's how I work. There's a kind of assumption that supervision isn't your one-stop shop. You've got more work to do after you've come, and please do some work before you come. Having said that, I'm very happy to work emergently because sometimes the unprocessed stuff is where you get some really good, interesting data. But in principle, really think about what you're bringing, because use me for the crunchy stuff, not the stuff you could do elsewhere. So I think there's something in that setup. Every supervisor will work differently, but there's a kind of mentoring persona that I bring at times. And sometimes when you're seeing somebody not quite grasping an insight, it can be helpful to share a story about how you got some insight on something similar. So you're not telling them what to do, but telling them what happened to you when you did something in an encouraging kind of way. We talk about role modelling. I suppose that's where that comes in.
That was the word in my head as you were describing that. There's a role modelling element.
Yeah.
And role modelling in a safe environment where there's no right or wrong.
No, that's right. And as always, this worked for me. It may or may not work for you. And I suppose there's something about the work that I've done that's captured in the book, the work that I do each month on reflective practice calls, is exploring, when it's right, how they have attempted to unpick this for themselves and what do they need to unlearn or what do they need to experiment with. So, yes, there's something about the kind of work that's gone into the book and that's gone into the monthly sessions, bringing that into a dialogue about saying, well, what more could you do to explore this for yourself? What works? And one of the simple things, I think, is about finding the place and time to do it. I talk about finding your reflective self. And I talk about a time when I was doing both consulting and coaching and how I'd taken a consulting call just before a coaching session. And when I got feedback from that coaching client about how it was, they told me how punchy and pacey I'd been. I thought, oh, thanks. And that wasn't actually my intention.
Thanks, but wasn't quite what I was aiming for.
No. And the penny dropped. I'd taken my consultancy persona into the coaching session. And so if we're in London, just having finished with a client and we're trying to reflect and we're in a cafe where there's barista going mad in the background and half of us has got an eye on our watch because we need to get to the next one in time, probably not your best reflective self. So really having to think about when can we engage in reflection in a meaningful way rather than a task-oriented way. Because we might have done it, but we might not really have got to that deeper level. We've just captured some notes that record what's happened, but perhaps don't really allow us to sort of investigate and pull back the weeds on what happened. So that would be a conversation about how do we help them find their reflective self? Because you've got to unlearn so many of the mantras that are pushed towards us.
Yeah, and I think that there really is that difference between, and in my experience, coaches can get caught in that if I record and I write what happened in the session, that's my reflection. And it's like, yeah, no, there's...
Not quite.
But that, again, you're pointing to that the work, in a way, like coaching, ideally, happens outside the session. Yeah. That's where it really matters. Yes, we want to have a great, productive, with some new thinking. But actually, unless something shifts outside the session, then it's probably not going to be sustained.
That's right.
And so kind of setting that up. And again, we've talked about it, but I wonder whether it's worth exploring in a bit more detail what you see or what you believe, or maybe these are just my assumptions around supporting newer coaches versus to coaches who are more experienced in terms of these kind of practices?
Yeah. The first difference that comes up for me is about what practitioners are ready to explore and ready to see. Because I quite like the seven-eyed model because it highlights that whichever route we take to explore something, we will have missed six others. So there's a kind of an implicit assumption that we will have followed a path for good intent and in doing so have discounted many more other paths. So there's something about if we try to explore everything, it could be overwhelming. And so certainly as a newer practitioner, it often tends to be about tasks and interventions and he said, she said, what did I choose? And that feels right and proper for somebody who's starting out on their journey. If we're taking a master coach and we're still talking about what interventions they chose, it feels like it might be necessary. But actually at that point, we're probably looking at a meta level of reflection. We're thinking, so what are the concerns that you've had or what are the noticings you've had over a number of sessions and how do we join those dots? What's that showing us? And in fact, a question I ask as a prep question for my advanced group is, what's your client work telling you about you? So it's really divorcing the activity and much more towards how are you showing up and why are you showing up in that way? And what's that telling you about where you are with you and your practice? So I think it's a sliding scale. You start at the basics and then over time, you begin to leave that behind some of the time. It's always interesting. As soon as a client triggers us, we go all the way back, don't we? But, if you're thinking about progression and evolution, I think at some point, patterns become more important than specifics. And if you try to do that patterning stuff at the beginning, it might be an ethical issue in the sense that actually they're not ready and that discombobulates them further. Actually, you need to understand the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts. And ultimately, what we hope in supervision, or what I hope in supervision, is that they can self-serve more. So it's not that the choices over an intervention are no longer important, but they can review that independently and think it through. But it's things higher up the curve that they need help with articulating or exploring. So that's the broad changes I think I see.
I think that in a way reflects coach development full stop to a degree in terms of moving from the what to the how to the who. And that's what you're talking about. But I'm mindful that you mentioned the seven-eyed model, that we both know what we're talking about, but I wonder whether just very briefly we should explain a 2-sentence summary. Michelle, I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I've been known for calling it the seven-eyed monster, so doing it in 2 sentences might be hard. But if people are interested, it was originated, I think, by Smith and Hawkins, and I think also beginning to identify that work indeed involved, is it Jean Robbins' wife as well? So it's not just the two of them. But effectively, you're looking at, let me try and remember the eyes. So the first eye is the client system. So when the client walks into the room, they don't walk in as in a box. They walk in with all of their history, all of their relationships, all of their messiness. Then I'll skip to I4 because that's the coach and you're in the room too. And guess what? You're not in a vacuum either. So you bring everything and all your history. At some point, you choose an intervention. That's number 2. So, the thing that you choose is going to be an output of what you see in the client, what you know yourself, and what you think is best. And that is influenced by number 3, because that number 3 is the relationship. And so I know myself, if I know a client really well, I'll take some risks. If I'm just getting to know them, I'll play safe. So all of those 4 things that we've talked about so far are interconnected and will influence what we do. What we then add in is the supervisor. And just like the client and the coach, we don't walk in clean either. We walk in with all of our history and all of our systems, and that influences what we see and what we might not see. So that's number 6, I think. Number 5 is the relationship between the coach and the supervisor. And just as we described the relationship, depending on how we are connecting will depend on what we feel ready to offer. And sometimes we talk about the parallel process. So we're trained to tune into the energetic sense of things. And it's no surprise when if the coach is feeling blocked by their client, the supervisor is often feeling blocked by their client, their supervisee. And why that's helpful is because we've probably been there ourselves in some shape or form. We hopefully have got a greater ability to articulate what it is that we're experiencing, and that might inform a conversation which might open some awareness for the coach then to think about their relationship with their client. So that's the parallel process bit. And then all of that is set in a context. I certainly do coaching in an organizational setting most of the time. And guess what? The mood of the organization might set a tone for the work. If it's uncertain and going through a cost-cutting phase, then they're going to be nervous and fear in the system, and that might filter through, and any one of those individuals might be experiencing that. And then, of course, we've got beyond the organization to the bigger landscape, and my goodness, don't get me started on how that is affecting. We felt it in COVID, I think, about that kind of angst, existential fear. And I think that's around us now. And of course, that will ripple through. Even though it's a protected space, it's going to ripple through. And it's quite likely we will sense that in some shape in the coaching and in the supervision. And the 7I just invites you to turn your attention to that particular part of the system and explore it. But as I began to say, all of the eyes are connected with them. So to just think about them in isolation wouldn't be helpful. You have to see them in the round.
But I think, as you say, it's actually explaining it is helping unpick the complexity of what we're dealing with, and that actually reflection means that we can choose which we're working at. But again, the patterns, if we're only ever thinking about our client or only ever thinking about ourselves, what are we missing? What are we not looking at? And how do we support people to move beyond that?
And I think it is a really helpful model to encourage us to be comprehensive. So my background is psychology, and it's large organizations. So if I'm reflecting independently or supporting somebody as their supervisor, my go-tos are number 1 from the psychology and number 7 because of the HR. So I can trust myself to explore that, but I might need to remind myself to explore one of the others, because we'll all have preferences and bias, right?
Yeah. And as you say, that may also come from how I've been taught, what's been reinforced through our supervision practice, where our level of comfort are that it's so, again, multi-layered and complex, which is what makes it interesting, how this works.
Absolutely.
So as we come to the end, Michelle, how would you summarise for our listeners? I know, again, I'm putting you on the spot. What do you think are the takeaways as coaches and supervisors that would be really helpful?
Well, I'm just thinking there's a slide in one of the workshops I do is the first, there's a reflection moment, and I say, okay, what's your go-to method of reflection? Second question, where did you learn that? And the third question is, when did you last test that? So I think most of us have a way of being with our reflective practice. I think it's quite likely that will have emanated from our training, from the networking groups that we go to, what other people, what our peers do. And I would really encourage people to test that to make sure that it may have worked 5 years ago. Is it still working for you now? What else might you supplement that with? I absolutely think that diversity in our reflective practice is a good way to go. So clearly we're going to have preferences, but if we're trying to sort of go down the rabbit holes and see the corners and lift up stones, we perhaps need to do things that we don't necessarily feel the most comfortable with. It can be some of the stretching things that help us see things that we couldn't otherwise see. So I think those would be the 3 takeaway questions for people.
And just to clarify, when did you last test it? How do people test it?
Plug.
Excellent. Good. Love it.
What a lovely question. So yeah, this is a book that...
Do you want to read the title? Or you have to go, because people aren't going to be able to see it?
It is Creating the Reflective Habit.
We'll put the link in the podcast.
Put the link in the resources. It's got 5 different chapters, which have 12 prompts per chapter. And they are visual, auditory, kinesthetic, cognitive, and poetry. And so you can quite deliberately, when you want to reflect, pick a topic and then use all the number 1s from the chapters and see, well, which one takes me the furthest? Or you can take potluck and open it to a page and think, would that be helpful? There's no way round, only through, right? So testing it is about knowing what you would naturally do and then finding alternative exercises, prompts, inspiration that might take you a different path. And newsflash, some will take you down a dead end.
Or just won't work, or you'll just still be staring at the blank page.
Yeah.
That's okay. But that's knowledge,
okay,
isn't it?
But it's data. So I wouldn't be afraid of trying things and them not working. And also, as we talked about right at the start, is so if there's nothing or if there's resistance, what's that about? That in itself might be information. There are actually an increasing number of books out there about reflective practices. So yes, I've written one on open bracket. I've just got a contract for doing the second edition.
That's exciting.
Which is going to be expanding the reflective habit.
Great.
But it won't be around for quite some time yet. But there's lots of people that are getting interested in reflective practice. So doing a little bit of research, Dr. Google or ChatGPT or whatever it might be these days.
But essentially trying something different.
Try it.
Is what I'm hearing when you say test it. It's try something else to see what else is out there and what else might work for you. Yeah.
Only by that will you know if it works the same or better or worse than what you're currently doing. And, you know, if it doesn't work, but your traditional method did, well, that's evidence that you've got a good way forward for you.
And I feel like I interrupted you. You were going to offer the 3 questions and then you were going to go somewhere else, which you may not remember now.
No. I do think experimentation is the key thing. Just diversity in our reflective practice is really helpful. I mean, so much of what we don't naturally hold in our awareness is because it's slightly hidden. It's not in our normal furrow. So we've got to use different ways of accessing it. So I would say experiment and aim for diversity, even if you know that, let's say, journaling is working really well for you. How might you supplement that? And I think that goes for supervisors as well as supervisees, constantly looking to keep things fresh. And then we're walking our talk for one, and we've got more collateral to share with our colleagues.
And I think, as you say, there's so much out, our brains, and we're so overwhelmed by information that we know our brains work by narrowing down. And what I love about reflection is that it opens it up and helps us access those bits that, as you say, are hidden or we've just not shined the light on.
Yeah, well, that's a nice phrase. I think, they might not be hidden. It's just that we haven't put the light on them.
So, Michelle, what a joy. Thank you so much for this conversation. How can people access you, get in touch with you? You've talked about the book. You've mentioned the reflection spaces.
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. So that's probably the easiest way to reach me. And the company is called Greenfields. So I'm sure we've got a resource page, but Routledge commissioned me and they also give me a discount code.
Oh, great.
It's EFLY02 and that will give you 20% off any of my Routledge titles. So feel free.
Lovely. We'll put that in as well. And I know you've also done lots with the Association of Coaching through the digital learning. So again, there's some seminars and that kind of stuff out there.
People can still access that.
Yeah. So thank you so much. What a joy.
All right. Well, lovely to speak to you, Helen.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership, tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching expertise.